Pokémon is one of the most recognisable franchises in the entire world, with Pikachu being the mascot most companies can only dream of. It has grown into a multi-billion pound industry, spread into almost every conceivable form of media and become synonymous with Nintendo and gaming. It all started with a simple game about a trainer leaving a town to become a Pokémon Master. This is the making of Pokémon Red, Green and Blue. Satoshi Tajiri founded Game Freak in the 1980s, an arcade-focused magazine which was handwritten and stapled together. He came up with the idea in 1978 after becoming addicted to Space Invaders and realising that there wasn't any good media for information on gaming, and wanted a way to share his love of gaming. According to an interview with Game Center CX, Tajiri spent a lot of his free time in arcades in Shimokitazawa. He preferred going to arcades owned by game developers, and Taito had an arcade there that he would frequent. In 1983, Tajiri started selling booklets about strategies for arcade games for 200 yen a pop, with the first issue being about Dig Dug. These were only sold in specialist stores, as home console gaming was not widespread in Japan at the time. Later, Tajiri teamed up with a local player who broke 10 million points and sold over 15,000 copies of this guide for Xevious. It's worth mentioning that this information was taken from an interview with him for Game Center CX, as the Wikipedia page about him mentions a game called Xevious, which doesn't exist and is probably a mistranslation from an older source. Ken Sugimori, veteran Game Freak artist, became friends with Tajiri through these books and later joined the company, illustrating the magazines and booklets. This led them down the road of wondering what they would do differently if they were the ones actually developing the games, rather than just creating strategies for them. They believed that many games on the market were of low quality, essentially they could do better. In an interview with Time magazine in 1999, Tajiri stated that he grew up with manga and anime, and that if game design didn't exist, he would have gone into anime creation instead, stating that they are common concepts requiring similar levels of creativity. Tajiri began studying the Family Basic Programming package in order to learn how to create games for the Famicom. They hired some more readers of the book, mainly those who had experience in programming and access to hardware, and started producing video games, starting with Quinty. Quinty, otherwise known as Mendel Palace, was released for the Famicom in 1989. After the completion, the company started thinking about new games. Those would be Jerry Boy, which released in 1991. After this, more games came for Sega, Victor and Nintendo. They then created the classic NES title, Yoshi. Finally, Tajiri hit upon an innovative idea. This idea would become Pokémon. The original idea came from Satoshi Tajiri's childhood, in which he spent hours upon hours collecting insects, a popular pastime in 1970s Japan. He was known for this in Makita, where he grew up, and was even known to the local children as Dr. Bug. He loved nature and was deeply affected by the constant deforestation in the area, and he noticed a decrease in the insect population. He was fascinated by insects. Every time he found one, he wanted to investigate it, see how it lived and interacted with the world. In the interview with Time magazine, Tajiri states that because insects became rare, kids no longer were able to enjoy this pastime, so he wanted to create it digitally. He stated that the ingredients for Pokémon were playing video games, watching Ultra 7 and catching insects. The idea to make the game for the Game Boy was sparked by the idea of the communication cable. He thought of living organisms moving back and forth across the cable, a form of interactive communication rather than a competition. He likened the communication cable to karate. Two players compete, they bow to each other. It's the Japanese concept of respect. The idea for trading came from his experience in Dragon Quest. There was a magic hat he wanted in the game that he couldn't get, and Ken Sugimori had two of them. Obviously, they owned different carts. If only they were able to trade them. That's when the idea of trading in Pokémon was truly born. He was influenced by games such as Final Fantasy Legend to create an RPG rather than an action game. Originally known as Capsule Monsters, this was changed due to trademark issues, with them eventually settling on Pocket Monsters. Originally, they had a massive amount of ideas for the game, but the core concept was always there: collecting Pokémon in a big RPG world. Some of the early designs of Pokémon came from Tajiri's insects. Poliwag was based on tadpoles, for example, and Tajiri stated that it is his favourite Pokémon, the swirl on its chest representing the surprise he felt as a child finding frogs and tadpoles for the first time. Others are based on Japanese proverbs, such as Meowth, which is about a story about a cat which has money on its head, not knowing it's there. In Japan, Pika is the sound they say an electric spark makes, whilst Chew is the sound a mouse makes, hence Pikachu. Tajiri stated that all employees had input on the designs and they were constantly brainstorming. They started off targeting just 50 Pokemon, a paltry amount if compared to what they eventually released with. Junichi Masuda, who produces the current games but back then was a coder and music artist, said that from inception to completion it took about 6 years, an extremely long time, especially in the world of 90s gaming, which had much quicker development cycles than modern games do. The main character, Satoshi in Japan, is essentially supposed to be Tajiri as a child, and his opponent, Shigeru, is a sort of Miyamoto figure, someone whom Tajiri always looked up to as a mentor and role figure, memorialising each piece of advice he gave him. Masuda stated that they started by creating loads of Pokemon designs, and slowly reduced that down to their favourite 150. They then started working on the moves, and decided how it would all fit together. Overall, Masuda reckons it took 3 years to nail down the designs and movesets of the 150 Pokemon they intended to include in the cartridge, a huge amount of time. Ken Sugimori, his longtime collaborator, created all the designs for the Pokemon in the game with a team of fewer than 10, drawing the Pokemon at as many angles as possible for the graphics department to be able to render them properly in-game. The battle system in most RPGs is quite black and white. Your team are the good guys and your opponents the bad guys. But because you can catch opponents and it's supposed to be friendlier, this concept doesn't really exist in Pokemon. Tajiri explained it like this: if a horse runs over you and you die, then the horse is bad. But if you're riding the horse is your ally. So if you have a monster in your collection, then it's considered good. But if not, it's still not considered bad because it could one day be your friend. Additionally, it's become a staple of Pokemon for the creatures to faint rather than die. This was done because Tajiri believes young people had an abnormal concept of dying, treating it trivially and not treating the subject with the respect it deserves. He also believed there was too much violence in gaming, so the battles did not have blood. Junichi Masuda created the iconic music for the game. Utilising the 4 sound channels of the Game Boy, Masuda stated that this was coordinated by 2 square waves, 1 triangle wave and 1 white noise, creating the music, sound effects and Pokemon cries. For the music for the game, Masuda created a skeleton of 30 15-second pieces of music, which he would later expand on. For example, the title theme, he was able to add a gravelly effect by adding heavy white noise over and over to create a marching effect, and changing the volume of it a little, he could stimulate the sound of a snare drum. Despite the limitations of the system, Masuda was able to create an iconic soundtrack which is well known and loved to this day and has outlived its small origins. The team at the time had big dreams. They wanted to create a game that was beyond the limits of the Game Boy storage and hardware capabilities. Masuda stated that trading and communication was far more core in the original idea, but due to the fact that the Game Boy could only transfer small amounts of data, the original scope just wasn't possible. The limitations of the hardware forced the team to get creative. In order to conserve storage space, they made it so the player never actually moves. They are always static. Instead, the map itself is what moves, giving the illusion of movement, but saving on having to keep loading areas. Whilst it's become a staple now, releasing 2 slightly different versions of the same game was a unique proposal at the time. In an interview with Gamasutra, Masuda stated that this idea came from furthering the concept of making trading more attractive, as it wouldn't be possible for any one person to complete a Pokédex on their own, forcing the communication aspect. Miyamoto himself actually gave this idea to Tajiri, stating that, "How about creating different cartridges? There are different Pokemon in each cartridge and people are willing to trade the Pokemon." When it came to finally release the 2 versions, they knew what they wanted to do: red and green. In Japan, red and green are thought of as opposite colours. The game finally released in 1996, but when it was released, it had a slow uptake. It started picking up gradually, and with the release of other projects, such as the card game and manga, it rocketed. Nintendo did not originally believe the game would be a big success. The Game Boy was quite old by this point, and it was a brand new franchise. However, the success clearly caught Nintendo's eye, and they massively invested into the series, mushrooming into a $4 billion industry in Japan by 1998, according to Peter Main, Nintendo of America's then Executive Vice President of Sales. After the success in Japan, it was clear they wanted to release the game internationally, but it posed some problems. It wasn't known if the game would be a success in the West. According to Masuda, Japanese developers believe that RPGs did not sell well outside of Japan. In an interview, Satoru Iwata revealed that Hiroshi Yamauchi, Nintendo president at the time, was sent a proposal of muscle-bound characters that were supposed to be used, as localization teams believed that cutesy characters would not do well in the West. He refused, seeing it as a worthy challenge to make Pokémon popular. Red and green were not seen as opposites in the Western world. Instead, it was red and blue. Additionally, a bigger issue is that of storage space. English takes up more space than Japanese characters, so physically fitting the data on the cart was almost impossible. The team had to come up with lots of memory solutions to solve it, such as changing Pokémon names and various screens in order to save some data. This explains why it took 2.5 years to release the game in the rest of the world. It was a technical nightmare. They decided to model the remade game on the refined version that was later released in Japan through mail order, Blue version, which featured updated artwork, dialogue and sound. It also fixed some bugs which were present in the original and was overall a more polished entry. The storage deficiency was evident in the final product. Many pieces of text are quite truncated and brief. There were character limits on menu terms, character, Pokémon and item names, and even on attacks. Masuda said that in the original Japanese versions, the Pokédex had just one screen, while in the US and European versions it had to be changed to have 2 screens. Hiro Nakamura led the localization effort, renaming everything for Western audiences based on their appearance and characteristics, and using Western naming conventions rather than Japanese. Pokémon Red and Blue was finally released in 1998. Thanks to Nintendo's licensing deals and huge marketing budget, it quickly took over the Western world, with the anime, merchandising and everything in between quickly becoming pop culture icons and defining many people's childhood and adolescence. Tajiri actually stated in 1999 that he believes Western audiences understand the concept of Pokémon better than the Japanese. This was because in the merchandising, he saw that Japanese children just wanted Pikachu, whilst Western children wanted both Ash and Pikachu together. This concept of togetherness was what Pokémon was all about. Pokémon as a series has flourished ever since then and exists to this day. Looking back on those older games, it's easy to see some of the flaws which were fixed in later entries. Despite this, for many people, it holds an immovable place in their hearts, an icon of a simpler time, marrying up perfectly with childhood dreams of adventure. It was a revolution, both technically and culturally, bringing one of the few franchises which truly resonates across the entire world. Pokémon is special, and it owes it all to those simple origins.